And now, a passage from The Story of Henry E. Huntington, Constructive Capitalist, by Isaac F. Marcosson, a little-known master of millions. A big man, broad of shoulder and deep of chest, with blue eyes and a white military mustache, sometimes sits at a plain roll-top desk in a room on the 13th floor of a Broad Street skyscraper in New York, where his ears are assailed by the incessant tumult of the money mills. Curiously enough, though he seems to be in Wall Street at intervals, he is not of Wall Street. Unobserved and practically unknown, he passes amid the captains whose fame and fortune are widely exploited, yet few individuals rank with him in volume and distribution of personal wealth. He has a process of financing peculiarly his own. Though his family name is linked with epic corporate conquest, he has kept studiously in the background, remaining by choice and inclination one of the really few aloof but dominating figures in the most fascinating of all games. Such is Henry E. Huntington, favorite nephew of the masterful Collis P. Huntington, whose recent marriage to the widow of that colossus of the coast not only set up a new milepost in the march of American fortune, but attracted public attention to a career as remarkable in many ways as it is little known. Because he happened to be the nephew and heir of a prince of capital, there is an impression that good luck coddled him in her luxurious lap and made his life, almost from the start, a bed of gilded ease. As a matter of fact, Henry E. Huntington was a wealthy man by his own efforts, long before the massive figure of Collis P. Huntington yielded to the burden of years. California knew him as a resolute steam and electric railway operator, as a discriminating investor, as an active developer of natural resources and sections of railroad back east before his western day, owed their construction to his grit and determination. When vast legacy did come to him, it was simply harnessed up to activities planned or already well established. Into a decade, he crowded what most men do not accomplish in a lifetime. He put Los Angeles on the map and is today the largest realty owner in Southern California. A whole traction domain calls him Lord. His influence is strong in half a dozen railroads. By his historic sale of the control of the Southern and Central Pacific to E.H. Harriman, he gave that spectacled little wizard the most necessary principality in his then widening empire. With his wife, he owns outright the largest private shipyards in America. He is a king in power production, 53 directorates, east and west, that touch all kinds of business in some way, know his counsel and sometimes his presence. As an aesthetic side diversion, he has accumulated perhaps the finest private library in the world, alongside of which Mr. Morgan's heralded book treasures, with some exceptions, are almost commonplace. What sort of man, then, is this, who in a time of strident publicity and in the face of all this achievement can escape the fierce light of exploitation that beats about the very rich? For one thing, he is naturally modest and reserved. His methods, too, are very quiet. Where his mighty uncle loved the clash and turmoil of spectacular conflict, he works without friction and almost in seclusion. Now, for the first time, are revealed the intimate facts of his life. It is a narrative of typical American performance, studded with the drama of well-nigh incessant action. All through it lurks the craggy presence and influence of Collis P. Huntington. Uncle and nephew worked closely together and with a common vision. They were, in a measure, the inheritors of the same renown. They had the rare genius of being able to wait for results. They builded for the morrow. In short, Henry E. Huntington is a sort of reincarnation of Collis P., with the same thrift, foresight, and constructive energy, although lacking, in some respects, the tremendous and commanding personality of the welder of the Southern Pacific. An early responsibility. Since this is the first real glimpse into the Huntington career, let us begin at the beginning. Probe the boyhood of men of affairs and you find the qualities that shape large careers. Following the best traditions of the self-made, Henry Huntington began as clerk in a country store up at Oneonta, New York, where he was born. Here his father and his father's brother, the great Collis P., had their first merchandising experience. In a way, CP never ceased to be a merchant. His whole theory of business was summed up a single sentence. Anything that can be bought for less than the cost of production, that is not perishable, and that is an article in general use, is worth buying and holding. It is part of the H.E. Huntington philosophy too, as you shall soon see. Where Henry H. Rogers and Russell Sage handled their first money over sugar and eggs, Henry E. Huntington wrestled with the more difficult problem of hardware. The way he got his first job was characteristic. When he was 17, the leading hardware merchant of the place, who had just stocked up his establishment, fell sick. He was distrustful of most people, but he liked young Henry, who had run errands for him. He sent for the lad and said to him, "Henry, I am sick. You've got to run the store." "But I don't know anything about running a store," said the boy. "Never mind," responded the merchant. "You're honest and you are apt." The net result was that this mere child took charge of the place and ran it successfully for a month. It was the first of many experiences of his that were to prove that instinct and not training is sometimes the best essential to business. He liked the hardware store so much that he remained in it for nearly 2 years, fitting himself for life just as his uncle had. Meanwhile, the name of Huntington had flashed across the continent. When Henry was 19, his uncle had helped to make possible and had participated in that epoch-making ceremony out on the Utah plains, when the last spike of the Central Pacific was driven, linking east and west with bonds of steel. The boy's imagination was fired by this stirring event, so he started out to make his way in the world. By means of correspondence, he got a position in a big wholesale hardware store in New York City. Here came the first real contact between uncle and nephew, Collis P. Huntington, who still conducted his store in Sacramento in connection with Mark Hopkins, often came to New York to buy goods or to raise money for those constantly widening railroad projects, in which he had become increasingly powerful. He would drop into the store where his nephew worked, buy a bill of goods, and then casually inquire how the boy was getting along. Always he got good reports. One day, when the lad was still under 21, he said to him, "Edward, I guess you had better come with me," whereupon the boy answered, "How much will you pay me?" This question was unsentimental, but somehow it pleased the big-bearded man who had begun to make history in the East, even as he had already left the imprint of his power in blazing the railroad way across the western mountains. For he had just acquired what came to be called the Chesapeake and Ohio Railroad in Virginia. The state has been trying to complete it from Richmond to a western connection, and several contractors had become bankrupt in the attempt to cross the Blue Ridge. But C.P. Huntington loved difficult tasks. As he looked into the situation, he found out one reason why the contractors had failed. They were being gouged to death on their supplies. And in order to prevent this, he sought the aid of the alert, bright-faced young nephew who was clerking in the New York hardware store. One of the first evils that he sought to remedy in his new Eastern construction was the excessive price of ties. In some places, the lumbermen were charging $1 apiece. "I'll cut my own ties," said Mr. Huntington. So he bought a mill on Cold River at St. Albans, West Virginia, and offered Henry the job of running it. "I don't know a thing about a sawmill, but I'll do my best," he said. Once more, an untrained man, he was put up against a responsibility that required technical experience. The seasoned lumberjacks laughed at the beardless boy when he took hold, but he soon changed their laugh. One night, a courier came racing down the valley with news that a flood was coming. The old lumbermen shrugged their shoulders and went about their business, but Huntington leaped on a horse, roused his men, and set out to make fast his rafts in which a young fortune was tied up. After working all night, the first fury of the flood broke loose. The other sawmill men were caught napping, but Huntington's logs, through his incessant watchfulness, which lasted 3 days and nights without sleep, held fast, and he did not lose a stick. Most of the other rafts were sent scattering down the raging river. Huntington ran the mill so successfully that he reduced the price of ties from $1 to 28 cents. Early in the 70s, C.P. Huntington sold the sawmill. To his surprise, he found that one of the new buyers was his nephew. Soon the young man manifested a quality which has been with him ever since, even in his largest enterprises. He felt that the best way to proceed with any business is by complete possession. He wanted all the profits and was prepared to accept all the responsibility. So he borrowed enough money from his uncle to become proprietor. It was a sad time for business. The Panic of 1873 was coming on apace and times were hard. But the young man weathered all the storms, paid his uncle in full and with ample interest, and retired after 3 years with his first real financial nest egg. The first railroad building. Meanwhile, C.B. Huntington was pressing the Chesapeake and Ohio onward across the wooded stretches of West Virginia, down through Kentucky, on to Tennessee. It was part of a vast vision that saw, in the end, the glistening line of steel that would stretch unbroken from the Virginia tidewater to the shores of the Sunset Seas. But it was hard sledding. Railroads may be finished, but systems are never completed. The bearded magnate had to pick up a line of completed rails here, build a stretch there. There was a yawning gap of 65 miles down in Tennessee on what came to be the Chesapeake and Ohio Southwestern, joining Louisville and Memphis. It had to be filled up at once. Again, the master builder turned to that shrewd, resourceful nephew who had successfully run the sawmill in West Virginia. He said to him while on a visit to New York, where he was wrestling with the money gods of Wall Street, "Edward, someone will have to build that stretch of road down in Tennessee, and I guess you are the man to do it." For the third time, a job that demanded seasoned experience was put up to Henry Huntington. And again, he accepted. The nearest he had ever come to railroad building was to cut ties, but his shrewdness, his ability to organize men, and his sense of economy came to his aid. He was launched as railroad builder. He set up his headquarters in a freight shed at Trimble. The line ran from that place to Covington, and despite the fact that he knew nothing of practical engineering, he finished the task 2 months ahead of the scheduled time. Several incidents of that first railroad construction show the bent of the man, and the reason why he has succeeded in whatever his hand has touched. Once he was out on horseback inspecting a section, he saw a group of men unloading ties from a wagon. They stood alongside, lifted the heavy beams above their shoulders, and then threw them to the ground. It was a slow and laborious process. Stopping the laborers, he said, "You are doing that wrong. I'll show you an easier way." He mounted to the wagon, and with one foot on the tongue and another on the ties, showed how easy it was to push them rather than lift them up. Soon after, he encountered a gang spacing ties. 40 men were engaged in the job. They fairly fell over each other as they walked back and forth. He sent away all but 16, formed them in military line, and showed how much quicker and easier it was to do the work when you had some system and order. These apparently simple episodes merely marked the application of what the world now calls scientific business methods, which by any other name are just common sense efficiency and economy of time and effort in any work. Galvanizing dead properties. Such a good account did Henry Huntington give of himself in this piece of construction that his uncle pressed him for further service. Collis P., in the interim, had pushed his enterprise to the Virginia coast by creating the port of Newport News and extending the Chesapeake and Ohio to the Eastern Sea. The great Newport News Shipbuilding and Dry Dock Company was soon to rise their further tribute to Huntington genius. One by one, he had gathered up central and southern lines to form the chain to New Orleans, where it was to meet the Southern Pacific as it swept eastward from the coast. The transcontinental dream was soon to be realized. Among the roads that passed under his masterful hand was a feeder to the C&O called the Kentucky Central, running south from Cincinnati and connecting up half a dozen important Kentucky towns, chief of which was Lexington. Mr. Huntington offered his nephew the post of vice president and general manager. "Do you want a figurehead or someone to really run the road?" asked the nephew. "Go ahead and run the road your own way," was the great man's instruction. Henry E. Huntington now established himself at Cincinnati and then proceeded to examine the property. He found it staggering under debt, with broken down equipment and with less than 10% of the business to Lexington. Here he showed another of the characteristics that seemed to have marked his whole conduct of affairs, for he said, "If this road is to earn money, then the tools with which to earn it must be in the best possible condition." It was likewise the rule of Collis P. Huntington. He overhauled the property, put in new equipment, and made the roadbed safe. The inevitable receivership came, but on being made receiver, he brought the road out of its troubles, and when he left it after 4 years, it had a surplus and was doing 90% of the business to Lexington. By instinct, quiet and aloof, he once showed during those Kentucky Central days that he is a man not to be trifled with. He found it necessary to make a 10% reduction in wages, and he began with himself. But the yard crew over at Covington, just across the river from Cincinnati, protested and went on strike without notice. The men thought they had the vice president at a disadvantage because all incoming and outgoing trains had to pass through these yards. But Mr. Huntington said, "I'll man the trains myself." Calling in office clerks and levying on even the district freight and passenger agents for crews, he brought in the first train himself. He stood on a freight car with a lantern to see that there was no interference. This example of firmness and determination broke the spirit of the strikers. The next day, they humbly came back to work. You may be sure that this record of quiet achievement did not fail to make an impression on the virile old man who now practically held the transportation of the state of California in the hollow of his hand. He added to his nephew's railroad responsibilities in the East, and several other lines passed under his management. They are now part of the Chesapeake and Ohio system. Perhaps the most important of these later Eastern assignments was the general direction of the Newport News and Mississippi Valley Company, which controlled all the Huntington lines from Kentucky to New Orleans, now part of the Illinois Central System. To this larger sphere, he applied the same genius of detail and organization that had marked all his previous work, and to such a satisfying extent that Mr. Huntington now felt that the young man's place was at his own side. On to California. Thus it came about that early in the 90s, Collis P. Huntington made Henry E. his chief aide, installing him as direct personal representative in Central and Southern Pacific matters at San Francisco. Nominally, he was assistant to the president. In reality, he was the right-hand man and confidential agent of the dominating personality who was then perhaps the most discussed individual in the far West. Modest as was Henry E. Huntington's advent on the Pacific coast, yet it was filled with far-flung significance for the people and the prosperity of that whole sunlit region. It meant the beginning of a whole fresh constructive era. All his railroad experience, his genius in handling men, and his shrewdness in sensing situations came to his aid now. C.P. Huntington was master of a vast, far-reaching empire, and H.E. Huntington touched it at every point. In succession, he became second and first vice president of the whole Southern Pacific system. Perhaps no step of that early life in California was more important in shaping his later career than his connection with the Market Street Cable Railway of San Francisco. Here he came into direct contact for the first time with city transit. His swift and unerring business judgment told him that here lay the real future of transportation in this country, a process free in a measure from the irritating and costly perquisites of steam travel. The instinct for rejuvenation, which is a passion with him, found expression at once. With his faculty for organization, he was able to recast the city system and make of it a standardized and efficient unit. The restless desire for corporate expansion, which constantly spurred his uncle onto new activities, now stirred in the nephew. He was casting about for new fields to develop. When in 1900 came the event which changed the course of his life and gave him the means to fulfill the dream of individual conquest that had been beckoning ever since he set foot in the Golden Land. Collis P. Huntington died, and when his will was opened, it was found that Henry E. Huntington was one of the two residuary legatees of the vast estate. The other was the widow. Not less than 30 millions were now at his disposal. It was as if a sudden flood of gold had rushed in on artisan hands ready to fashion it into new and helpful enterprise. It was an hour full of destiny, too, for E.H. Harriman, that marvelous little man who more than once had lingered at the threshold of C.P. Huntington, coveting the Central Pacific for his own, now saw the opportunity to realize his cherished desire. With that resistless tenacity of purpose, which soon after carried him to a complete overlordship of the railway map, he now besieged the co-heir. Logically, Henry E. Huntington was the successor to his uncle as head of the Southern Pacific system. But already his own vision had beheld another goal. So he sold the control, carrying the Central Pacific with it, to Harriman, bade farewell to steam transportation, and set in to create a whole new epoch in electric transit.